background. Thank you. On Andrea before we pass things over to her and listen and have the opportunity to engage with her and her research. So Andrea is a senior research associate at the Annenberg Institute, Brown University, and she specializes in connecting educational research to practice and policy, especially focused on the experience and outcomes of historically underserved K-12 students, including multilingual learners. Her work is strongly oriented towards system change, and she's interested in how school and system leaders, professional learning, and policy shape equitable, affirming learning environments in which both students and educators can thrive. So I want to thank you, Andrea, for being here with us today. And thank you again, everyone, for your patience as we've had some technical issues. So we appreciate your patience as we just transfer over to Andrea, who is going to share her slides and share with us about her research. So thank you, Andrea. Yes, can give you one moment, no problem. We are going to use all of our linguistic repertoires to communicate here today, including some gestures. So thank you, Andrea. Andrea has been having some issues with the audio, but we are being creative here as we do as educators and researchers. So thank you, Andrea. Maybe while Andrea takes a moment, I forgot to actually ask. I know we have some new faces here today. So if you want to take a moment to put in the chat where you're joining us from today and maybe your role, wherever that is, wherever you are in the world. Oh, wonderful. Thank you. So we have someone joining us, Raphael joining us from Belgium. Thank you, Raphael, for being here with us today. We have people joining us from UW-Madison, from Oregon. Terrific. From all over the place. So thank you for being here today. As we wait for Andrea to be able to share her slides, throughout her talk, we're going to have the opportunity to ask questions and to respond to questions in the chat. So maybe we will start by seeing if there are some initial questions that you have based on Andrea's talk today, which maybe Marianne, I won't ask you to put the slides back up because then once Andrea goes to share, that'll be hard. So I can just read aloud the title of Andrea's talk, and if you have some questions that you would like to put in the chat. So the title of Andrea's talk today is Principles as Policy Translators: How Understanding Your Community Informs Emerging Multilingual Learner Programming. So based on Andrea's title, if you have some initial questions or thoughts that you would like to put in the chat, we can see if we can respond to those as we go. And Andrea, I think you've just rejoined. Maybe you can let us know if you're able to hear us and share your slides.
Andrea put a question in the chat. Do you see that, Esther?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Andrea, I'm not an Android expert, I must say, but if you are able to see at the bottom, well, maybe it's not the bottom, but if there's the bar with the different Zoom options. If you have a microphone one, there should be still the little arrow where you can join, um, or not where you can join, but where you can turn on your microphone. I think maybe we just heard you.
Yes, can you hear me?
Hi, Andrea. Yes, we can. I'm giving you a thumbs up. You might not be able to see the thumbs up, but yes, we can hear you.
Fantastic. So thank you all for being so patient. We're going to get started now if that's okay, Esther.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Thanks for your creativity.
Okay, so I appreciate everyone being so patient with me. As Esther mentioned, my name is Andrea Ochoa, and I'm a senior research associate at the Annenberg Institute at Brown. But this research, I developed it with my colleagues at the Johns Hopkins University Center for Safe and Healthy Schools, Rebecca Cruz and Claire Shin. So I just want to make sure that they get credit because they also helped with this study quite substantially. And so I believe I heard already that my title was presented, so thank you very much. And so principals as policy translators and community leaders. This is how we see principles in our study. This is how we conceptualize them. And so I want to give some background as to how we got to this conceptualization and why we think it's so important for how principals use policy to enact change, to make programs happen for students so that perhaps their students can have more equitable outcomes. And so first we consider principal experience. So the extent to which a principal has experience working with individuals that they serve, that makes a huge difference in how they enact programs and policies to make different programmatic changes in service of those students. So for example, if we're talking about emerging multilingual learners, if a principal has experience working as an emerging multilingual learner teacher prior to becoming a principal, that will inform how they enact policy. And so, for example, De Matthews and Izquierdo, they documented an instance of a school leader in a border town, the U.S.-Mexico border town, where they enacted a gifted education program for their multilingual learner students who spoke Spanish as a home language. And what this principal was able to do is to develop a nationally recognized program to be able to give access to students, regardless of if they were labeled as English learners or if they were if they just had Spanish as a home language. Maybe they had already been reclassified as English fluent, but then now they had access to gifted programs that were not only giving them access to advanced academics, but also giving them access to that advanced academics in their home language. And so this experience that principals come with when they get to that principal seat makes a huge difference about how they enact policies for their students. For example, Callahan et al. Argue that some individuals who may not have this background may conflate English language skill with intelligence and treat emerging multilingual learners or students who are labeled as English learners as having an academic deficit. And so we want to make sure that we take that into consideration when we're considering how principals enact policy. Another important thing is context. So principals work in these multi-layered contexts. They have their geography, their state, their district context. What does the policy landscape look like in their state at any given time? And so they have to use that information when they're deciding how to enact policy with regard to serving the needs of their community. And so, for example, some principals in some states might be more suited or prepared to support emerging multilingual learners if that state has historically served emerging multilingual learners, or on the contrary, if it's a state that is experiencing a very sudden growth in immigrant students or in other groups of students who might speak other languages at home, they may not be as suited to support. They might not have that infrastructure to support the students in their schools. Finally, we think about the principal role. So the principal role has changed substantially. Prior to 1970, the principal role was seen as managerial. They were building managers. But now principals more and more are seen as community leaders. They're tasked with improving instructional outcomes, really coaching teachers on improving best practices for instruction. And so all of these factors really play into how principals implement what they are tasked with by their federal government, state, local agencies, and then using that to suit the needs of their community. And so what we did was a qualitative interview study. And so when we're trying to think about how to understand these roles of principals and how they enact policy, the framework of policy implementation for social justice from Mavro-Gordado and White is very front of mind. It's very appropriate to think about, are we enacting policies just to meet the requirements, or are we enacting policies to really result in equitable outcomes for the students that we're serving? And so the students of that are focus of this study are emerging multilingual learners. And so the framework looks at policy implementation from transformative to technical. And so transformative would go above and beyond what is required by law, whereas technical would just be meeting the standards. And they also outline an understanding of policy implementation from perfunctory to deep. And so they posit that if principals have a perfunctory understanding, they may not be able to, that might have bearing on how they implement it. And on the other side, if they have a deep understanding of policy, that plays into how they implement those. However, they developed this specifically to understand in their study about reclassification decisions. So how did principals use their understanding to make decisions about reclassifying students to English fluent? And so our team thought it was appropriate to use this framework to examine an array of policy decisions that the principals in our study must have to make. And so we're going to focus on the transformative to technical approach and the implementation, because that's the crux of what we get out of our study. I'll go over that a little bit more in detail in a bit about how our interview protocol did not lend itself for principals to demonstrate how deeply they understood the policies, because this comes from a much broader study on education policy. But we'll still be able to get a little bit at the extent to which principals understand policy mandates, but we care more about how they implement policy and what that means for their understanding of community, the community that they serve, so that both the staff and the students and families in their schools. So the research questions that we're going to address here: how deeply do principals understand their school community? Where do principal beliefs and actions fall on the continuum from technical to transformative? And to what extent do espoused and enacted values align? We'll focus less on that for time. And so our methods, like I said, this study comes from a broader study to examine how policies and practices influence school climate in California. And so we deployed a survey, substantial list of survey questions to California school principals. We got almost 250 respondents. Those respondents at the end had an opportunity to say whether they would be willing to participate in a survey, in an interview to understand more how their policies and practices influence school climate. So very broad topic. We got 18 individuals to interview. However, we only included 14 principals in our analytic sample, because only 14 principals highlighted or talked about emerging multilingual learners as a focus area for their strategic planning, for their policy making, for the programs that they're making decisions about in this very short, semi-structured 30-minute Zoom interview. These were conducted in the 2022-2023 academic year. And so here are just some sampling of the interview questions that were asked, and it can kind of give you an understanding of these principals could talk about any group that they serve. And so kind of because of the semi-structured nature of the interview protocol, different groups of students became the focus as we conducted the interview. So what do you think are the most pressing equity issues? What are some challenges that students experience? What kinds of supports do you have in place for your English learners or emerging multilingual learners? And so this is just a quick snapshot of our sample. we see that primarily serving elementary schools, primarily in public schools. So for those of you who are joining us from international audiences, we did have 2 charter school principals, and so charter schools have a little bit different regulatory processes. They are still publicly funded, but might have more autonomy in how they use their funds. They also might obtain more access to like philanthropic funding sources, whereas public schools might still get grants, but the public funding is primarily how public schools are operated here in the United States. About split for how participants reported their gender identity, more white principals than any other race ethnicity identity, and varied years of experience in education. We also had 5 of the principals were reported that they were former emerging multilingual learner educators. And so I also just want to say that, you know, when you do qualitative research, you have to be very transparent about who is doing the coding. And so myself and the second author, this is our positionality, so you can understand how that might play into the way we coded the data. So 2 women of color who prioritize social justice and education were labeled as English learners as children and pursued careers in education as classroom teachers, school and system administrators, and now research. And so our analytic approach of this interview data consisted of iterative rounds of deductive and inductive coding. And so what we did was we had each coder, so myself and the other researcher, coded 5 transcripts. Then we came together to norm on those transcripts and how we coded. We had a flexible code book that we were using, and we were modifying our definitions so that we had this shared understanding of what the definitions of the codes were. We were modifying and refining the exemplar quotes so that we could really have a clarity in how we were going to be coding. Once we arrived at agreement on those 5 transcripts that both of us coded, then we finally agreed on a final team code book. And then we used that to double code all of the transcripts. And so we organized our coding using the framework method, which is appropriate when you are comparing in interviews, specifically when you're comparing outcomes both across and between participants. And so we noted all of our codes in this framework, and we noted whenever there were disagreements. So whenever one coder had coded it differently, we met regularly, we resolved, and so we were able to have lots of discussions, grappling with each coder's implicit and explicit biases, and so to be able to arrive at more reliable findings. And then once we both felt comfortable with what was in the coding matrix, we conducted thematic analysis to derive broader themes from what we found in our interview data. And so the results, I just want to remind the framework that we're working with, which has the policy implementation moving from transformative to technical, and then the understanding from perfunctory to deep. And so what we found was that we needed to add another layer to the framework. We found that, first of all, a lot of principals had a lot of ideas, and a lot of principals had a lot of action and a lot of policy implementation. And so it was important to code those separately, because you can have a mindset or ideas, but if you're not implementing those ideas, then it's not really going to result in anything for the students in your school currently. Ideally, those hopefully germinate into action. So we did need to separate that out a little bit. And additionally, we needed to add another layer from transformative to technical. We also needed to add a deficit mindset and or action. And so we did find that some principals espoused deficit ideas about emerging multilingual learners, and the action was more being non-compliant with policy requirements. So we needed to be able to have somehow to capture that, and so that is how we added this third level to the framework. And then, as I said earlier, the line of questioning did not allow for principals to demonstrate their policy understanding. And so we most so found that there was a relationship between your community understanding and your policy implementation. And so as we see, almost half, so 6 of our principals had transformative mindset in action and a deep community understanding. And so I'll also say that these are not circles, right? They're oblong shapes. And so we found that no principal fell just in one category, right? No principal was a transformative principal. Their actions and thoughts spanned. So we had some principals who were transformative to technical, mostly technical, or technical to deficit. And so because there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of dynamic decision making that happens in the principal role, we can't put anybody into one specific category. Okay, so I'm going to give you some examples of some of the principles, the principles that really exemplify these big buckets that we found. And so we found that those principals who had a transformative mindset and action also had a deep knowledge of their school community. So first off, we have Walter. Again, these are all pseudonyms. He's a high school principal with 24 years of experience. He was noting about his community that he wishes the elementary schools that feed to him focused on Spanish language instruction. So he feels strongly we should be teaching them Spanish, right? They should learn to read and write in their primary language first, and then everything else will follow. And so that was a frustration that he voiced about his community at large or his district. And however, when he actually gets the students, when he can actually do something about the students in his community, he makes his scheduling work for those students. So he said, very enthusiastically, I put all of our EL kids whose primary language is Spanish in advanced placement Spanish. They do very well. Oh my gosh, I have like 10, 12 sections, probably 300, 400 kids in AP Spanish, and they knock it off the charts. So he's very excited about being able, as the prior literature has noted, not just getting able to have access to Spanish language, but also have that really high rigor, high quality academic Spanish. And so these students, even though they may have been in a district that maybe was not prioritizing their home language, in his role as the school principal, he makes that happen through scheduling and ensuring that there's sufficient staffing to make that happen. Principles that were a little bit more nuanced, so transformative to technical. Kim, a K-8 school principal with 10 years of experience, who's also a former emerging multilingual learner teacher, she said, every single person on campus works with students, including me, the vice principal, the librarian. So all of our intervention is happening then. So no one is missing curriculum. It was very important to Kim to be able to give access to the general education curriculum, the core curriculum, to all students. And so she made scheduling and staffing work for that goal. This is a common thing that happens in U.S. schools, particularly because that's the context that this research is conducted in. I would love to hear more from our international listeners. But it often happens that students have to miss their core instruction because they're receiving English language development support. And so that was something that Kim felt very strongly about. And it's possible that because she's a former emerging multilingual learner teacher, she has that front of mind. However, there were also instances where Kim expressed very, just following the policy as written. So she described how her interventions work when deciding whether a student is going to be tested for special education. And so, at the end of her quote, she says, so we have enough pretty solid interventions in place that you're not just going to refer a kid because they don't speak English. And so again, that's Kim taking policy, enacting it, to the T, to be able to say, have data to justify her decisions, and also to be able to maybe mitigate that overrepresentation that research has shown of students who are labeled as EL and also in special education. And as I said, there were a few principals who had a lot of ideas, but hadn't really given examples of what they were doing for those students. And so this group, we called them a technical mindset, no action. So this is Grant. He's a K-5 school principal, 12 years of experience. He's in his third year at his current school. And so Grant was very enthusiastic about how savvy he was with his data. And so he said, we're one of the best schools in the area. We're a distinguished school. But when you dig into the data, you see that's great for 75, 80% of kids, but the same 20 to 25 who are struggling now have been struggling for 10, 15, 20 years. And so he's clearly frustrated with the system that his school district has been working within, where very specific, he's speaking about his Spanish-speaking students who are labeled as English learners, specifically in this instance, they have been underserved. And so he's frustrated by it, but he is in his third year at his current school. And so his solution is to implement math pacing guides and small group instruction. So he's still in an ideation phase for how to resolve the inequities that he sees. So he has some ideas, but he's not really implementing anything that's going to offset this historical underserving of this group of students. And finally, there were only 4 principals who either had deficit action or deficit mindset. And so I just have one example of what a deficit mindset looks like. And this quote exemplifies what the other deficit mindsets kind of were along the same lines. So Simon, he works in an alternative school setting, so K through 12. For those who may not be sure what alternative school means, it's typically somewhere where if children have been suspended overly in public education, in public schools, or if they have been removed for some reason from their local neighborhood school, they are sent to an alternative school. There's a lot of other reasons why a student might end up at an alternative school, but so Simon, who is also a former emerging multilingual teacher with 20 years of experience, he thinks it has to do with student mindset. He says, you've been here for multiple years. You should be able to pass this examination. He's referring to the English, being able to reclassify as English fluent examination. He finishes off his statement saying some of it has to do with motivation, some of it can be skill set also. So some of the principals did have a blaming the community, blaming the students approach. Like I said, there were very few of them. He is saying skill set, so maybe he is starting to think about ways that he could support students in building the skill set that they need to pass this examination. But right now, he's not seeing his role as a school leader in the way that he can make a change within his school or system regarding resources or programming that could support students to pass the examination. Notwithstanding that we all know that as students get older, it's more difficult to pass the examination in California. There's so many requirements that students must meet. So that's true as well, but that's not Simon's take. Simon's take is that it's kind of to blame the student for that. And so back to our the focus research questions for this presentation. How deeply do principals understand their community, and where do their beliefs and actions fall on the continuum from technical to transformative? Half of the principals demonstrated a deep understanding of their community and implemented transformative policies to address that deep understanding, to address those needs that they had identified. Most principals provided evidence of implemented EML policies according to the law. So that's encouraging that at least the minimum thresholds that are set at the district or state level or even federal law are being met. And non-compliant principals highlighted systemic barriers to compliance. So when we talk about that mindset versus action, I feel like the mindset, the deficit mindset, is more pernicious. It's a harder thing to change. The principals who were in deficit action were non-compliant with policies, and they highlighted why. They said, we can't hire a teacher. There are no teachers applying for our school, for our, emerging multilingual learner classes. We can't provide English language development classes. And so they did not blame the students, or they did not blame the community for not being able to provide the allotted number of hours for their students. And so I feel like that's something that a district or state leader would be able to address more specifically, whereas the mindset issue might be a little bit bigger of a barrier to take on. And so transformative policies have implications for students. That's the focus. That's why we're trying to get an understanding of how principals think and what they use to make these decisions. And so through principal action, such as creative scheduling, innovative use of funds, leveraging skills of teachers and staff, and obtaining community input, and I'll say obtaining community input means talking to the people you're serving. There is a lot of information that can be gathered through statistics and dashboards and data, and that's important. And most of my training is in quantitative social science, so I thought that this was important, but it's also really important to get the real understanding from your community. What are their needs? Who are they? Why are they there? Those are the things that really drove principals to enact policies that were going to be really transformative and tailored to their community. And so this means that they reduced the over-under special education qualifying decisions. They made sure that there were more timely reclassifications to English fluent. Timely just means appropriate, not necessarily too early or having students labeled for longer than they need to be. And they increased access to home language instruction, high-quality English language development through professional development, general education, advanced learning, extracurricular opportunities, and paths to graduation. And so some concrete examples of these actions that principals took included, scheduling field trips that would make sure that students had the access that their peers had to these cultural and social capital advantages that maybe a general population might have access to. So one principal highlighted, we do field trips to the beach. Some of these kids have been in this community. They're in California. Maybe they were like 15 miles away from the beach. They had never been to the beach. Zoos, museums, those types of things that are targeted and structured in a way that children can get the benefits from the activity, but then also can have opportunities to discuss and to be able to process how that advances their learning. The advanced learning opportunities, like I said, providing them in Spanish, providing after school opportunities to engage with Spanish literature, number of other opportunities that the principals, I can be more specific if the questions lend themselves to that. But it was really exciting to hear how these principals did disrupt the status quo with their creativity and with tailoring the programs and policies that they implemented to meet the needs of their community. So I hope that I thank you all for your patience with all the technical difficulties, and thank you for helping me figure that out. And I'm ready for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much for presenting your important study. And we're excited to have time now for questions. So you're welcome to if you have a question, you are welcome to put it in the chat. But we also have a group that would be happy if you would be willing to unmute and ask the question to Andrea directly. So feel free to take advantage of either of those options. If you'd like to put it in the chat, and Andrea will try and help manage that in the chat for you, or you're welcome to unmute and ask the question directly. So the floor is open if anyone would like to unmute and ask their question, or we can take a couple minutes if people would like to put questions in the chat.
Andrea, hi. I'm Rafael from Belgium. I'm originally Mexican. There is a part in your presentation that really touched me and that got me thinking about the decisions that we're making in school. And it's the case of whether students are missing instruction when they are receiving language support. I think that's been one of the most difficult challenges to tackle. Belgium is the size of Maryland. It's a small country, trilingual country and my school is located between French-speaking Brussels and Flemish-speaking Brussels. And we're an English-speaking school, so our children, should they decide to become residents of Belgium, have to learn one of the national languages. So we have the challenge of how to reduce cognitive load for children that need to be learning two or three languages at the same time. So we're juggling with that. We're juggling that. I felt a lot of empathy when you said that because the challenge is okay. So what is a priority? So in our case, it's one language. First, we want students to form relationships, to develop belonging, to find a way for them to be seen and that to ensure that we see them and that they see us and have the channel of communication. So we take them out of French or Dutch, put them into English, and then slowly create pathways for them to take the language of instruction. And what we have been very lucky here in Brussels, being the capital of Europe per se, with a lot of organizations that help us to support their mother tongues. So what in a way the answer for that issue that you mentioned that I empathize with is really looking at the offers of NGOs. Our school, we say, it's not just our building, it's really our neighborhood. It's really everyone that lends a service, and it's been a very transformative journey. We don't have a solution yet, but I just wanted to share that that point that you mentioned is something that I connect with deeply. So thank you for bringing it up.
Of course. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think that's amazing that you're building these multilingual, developing multilingual capacities in these children. Some of the principals in our study did mention other partners. I think National Urban League is one that comes to mind, that I saw recently in the transcripts. And so, yes, leveraging more of the resources of the community is definitely going to help build up the students. In the US, there is a tendency, I would say, to favor English over other languages, and so I think that's a thing that we have to grapple with, by state by state. I'm from New Mexico, and Spanish is in the state constitution, and so each state is going to have their own take on how they approach their instruction. But this country is very English centric, and so that is something that plays out and how school principals and how systems make decisions for children who speak other languages.
Go ahead. Thank you, Raphael, for your question, Andrea, for your response. And Irina, I see your hand, so please go ahead if you have a question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Andrea, for this really informative session. I was really interested in the conceptual framework that you had, and it also gets me to think a little bit. I work in the space of international education and in supporting bilingual education internationally, so in mostly low and middle income countries. And a lot of times we work a lot on questions of sustainability of programs in subsidies. And your talk made me think, for example, for the case of Cambodia, where they're trying to have basically multilingual education, but it's slotted under special needs at the Ministry of Education, and sort of repeating some of the errors that I think a lot of places have seen regarding emergent multilingual learners. And there was a moment, there was a batch of teachers after like I forgot how long, but a couple of years, no more than like approximately a decade, there were teachers that were former multilingual education, multilingual learners who are becoming teachers. But then again, now the state has barred them because they are indigenous and are not Khmer mainstream speakers, etc. But I guess my question was, you were saying in your and I think it comes to human resource management and such, but you're saying principals and their experience as teachers at emergent multilingual learners might have some impact on whether they're more transformative or more technical or such. And I just wondered what your data, did it confirm it or disconfirm it? And that could be really interesting for people who are doing more programmatic designs. And sort of seeing how to manage, teacher or the teaching workforce in general. Yeah.
Yeah, so there were 5 individuals out of my sample of 14 principals who were experienced as emerging multilingual learner teachers, and they ran the gamut of how they approached policy implementation. So I wouldn't say that informed them, but however, it's a very small sample, right, of 14 individuals. And one thing I didn't talk about, which I talk about extensively in the limitations, is these are self-selected individuals, right? So they took a survey. 250 people took a survey. 18 people said I would be willing to go through an interview process. So this might be a sample that's maybe not representative of principals in California. Maybe it just gives us a snapshot. They do span the state, so we can have like some idea about representation across different regions of the state. But who they are and why they chose to be part of the sample, plays a role into what we can take from these findings. I would hope that maybe me or my team would have capacity to dig more into the interview data. We might be able to have a little bit more solid evidence about whether that background informs what they do for their students, whether it be their emerging multilingual learner students, if they're transformative for their students with IEPs. So that's definitely a great idea for next steps for this research arm.
Thank you, Irina. Andrea, I'm not sure if you saw, but I'll just read it aloud for others who might be joining on their phones and such. A question from Jeanette in the chat. So thank you, Jeanette. So it says, your presentation was making me think about how transformative change requires buy-in and a broader mindset shift that changes the culture. I'm wondering how that played a role within buildings. Did the principals you spoke to talk about buy-in from teachers and other actors that allowed them to take more or less action?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. So some of the principals, and the number of years that they were the principal of a given school also varied. And so I think that made a huge difference about whether they had buy-in to implement those transformative policies. And so one principal was kind of in that phase of, I've been here for a few years. I'm trying to get teachers to think more transformatively about how they provide resources to students. The teachers in her school were very focused on, they're not achieving at the grade level standard. I need to get them tested for special education. And so this principal gave examples of how her coaching conversations with those teachers resulted in the teachers kind of slowly realizing that, that language acquisition takes time. Even if they have the certification, the CLAD, they still need to take time with helping those students develop those skills. And so as she's having those coaching conversations about, did you provide the intervention? Did you measure it over time? Did you see growth? How much time did it take for you to see growth? Do you still have this concern? Kind of having those informal check-ins that really helped the teachers kind of get on board with her initiatives, because they knew that they needed to be more patient with whatever their expectations of what children should be doing, especially children who are speaking multiple languages. We shouldn't have the same the teachers who've only taught students who speak English. You shouldn't have that English language skill set immediately, right? It needs to develop over time. And so I feel like that principle really exemplified how that happened. But it was very clear that the number of years the principal was in a school made a huge difference about that those growing pains of, I'm a new leader in this existing community, or I'm a new leader and I had to hire a whole new slate of staff, and how are we going to all move the bus toward the same direction? So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jeanette. And Rosa Maria has two questions that I think are related. So maybe I'll ask them both at the same time. This is probably our last question we'll be able to get to, but two questions, both about principal themselves experience. So the first part is, do any of your principals mention themselves having mentors or coaching that took multilingual education into account? And for the principals who are or were multilingual learners themselves, how did their own multilingual journey affect their mindsets and actions? So apologies for saying it like that as a double-barreled question, because I know it's two, but just in the interest of time, see if we think about the experience of the principals in receiving mentoring or coaching about multilingual education, and also their own journeys as multilingual learners.
Yeah, I would actually say that they didn't highlight the coaching aspect or what training they received. They would say whether they had that experience, what kind of teacher they were prior to becoming a principal, and that was just kind of like a set aside. And then they would go into the focus was more on the school and what they do in their school for their students. But that would have been interesting to see the differences in the types of coaching. I don't know if this is interesting, but just a lot of the principals were kind of the way they became principals was they were just tapped and said, can you be a principal? And so sometimes they were, a principal with a, alternative license, working toward getting the certification. And so it seemed like a lot of these principals kind of were not necessarily like, they didn't like pursue the principalship. Like it was kind of like given to them, or like they were told to do it. And so I think that's also part of how we staff schools sometimes is like it's just kind of like an emergency situation where we're just like putting warm bodies in places, and sometimes it works out really well and you put somebody where they can really like make a huge difference, and then other times you put people who might have a harder time adapting, or who might already have some preconceived notions about certain groups of students and what they can accomplish.
Sorry, now I'm the one having some technical issues for getting to mute. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for everyone for your questions as well. I know there are some more in the chat that we weren't quite able to get to, but thank you very much for your time, Andrea. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for just having some more insights into the role of principals and what that might mean to be shifting mindsets and actions. So thank you, Andrea, again for sharing. Just want to remind you that we would love to stay in touch. Thank you, Mariana, for sharing. That is our MLRC email. And so if you're not yet receiving kind of the information regularly about upcoming speaker series and other events and such that are happening, please make sure to reach out to us so we can make sure you're receiving that information. And we will be in touch about our next speaker series. We have a great lineup in starting in 2026. And so please make sure you reach out to ensure you get that information. So thank you again for being here with us. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And thank you again, Andrea, for a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good one.